Hello, and welcome to Loyola Marymount University. My name is Dennis Draper, and I'm the Dean of the College of Business Administration. Each year, we are fortunate to bring in a number of prominent business executives and special guest speakers to participate in our CBA lecture series. From high-ranking government officials, to leading journalists, to internationally acclaimed social entrepreneurs, all of our distinguished speakers share one common goal: to educate our students and local community on some of the biggest issues in global business today, all while reinforcing LMU's underlying mission of teaching business with ethics and social responsibility. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Good evening and welcome to the Rauh lecture. We have a few more people than we were expecting tonight. I understand we have another 50 to 75 people outside. So for anyone outside, you can see this on a live stream by going to la36.org and go to live stream, and you'll be able to get the whole event either on your cell phone or on your iPhone or on a computer. And otherwise, if all of you could just sit down over here and just make yourselves at home, and we'll try to make all this work. So while everybody is getting settled in, so if I could have your attention, please. While everybody is getting settled in, let me just make a couple of announcements here. My name is Ross Bingle, and this is the Rauh Lecture Series, the Paul A. Rauh Lecture Series. The Rauh Lecture Series is named for one of the College of Business Administration's most esteemed professors, the late accounting professor, Paul Rauh. Paul's legacy endures in the success that many of his students have had, many of his former students have had in the business world and in life. Many have gone on to become partners in accounting firms, partners in law firms. Some have become CEOs of major corporations. Some have become CFOs of major corporations. And to honor Paul, some of his old former students, I shouldn't say old former students, just former students, underwrote this lecture series. Some of them are here tonight, and in addition, we have here tonight several people who have made contributions to support the ongoing College of Business affairs here. So we just like to thank them for their continued support of the College of Business Administration and the accounting department. I'd like to thank some other people who made tonight's event possible. A special thanks to all the student volunteers who are working overtime with all of you here. Also to Nancy Donovan, our college events coordinator. And one of the hardest things we have to do here is get the word out to everyone, and obviously that worked. I want to thank all of the College of Business Administration faculty who encouraged their students to come. We'll have to work on that the next time. And I'd like to thank Natalie Durdek, our communications manager, and Roberta Kuhlman, of University Relations, for getting the word out to our alumni and the community at large. Most of all, I'd like to thank all of you for being here tonight. You've obviously are taking time out of your day to be here, and we are most appreciative of you being at this event. Now, I have about 2 minutes of announcements that I've got to make, and then we'll turn it over to Josh. First, I'd like to tell you about another event that is coming up 3 weeks from tonight. On Monday, November 5th, at 7:15, right here in Hilton Auditorium, the Distinguished Speakers Series, which is coordinated by my colleague Larry Kalbers, will have as a speaker Stephen Walker, Global Executive Director of the CO Roundtable. The Co-Roundtable is an international network of experienced business leaders who advocate a principled and ethical approach to global capitalism. Mr. Walker's speech is entitled, "Rising from the Ashes of the Global Financial Crisis, Moving Toward a More Sustainable Global Financial System." So we hope you all can make it to that event. I know I'm going to be here, and that's 3 weeks from tonight, Monday, November 5th. Let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to do tonight, and then we'll turn it over to Josh. After the lecture, there will be a short question and answer session. We'd appreciate it very much, especially with so many people being here, if you would remain seated through the Q&A, as our friends at LA 36 are recording this for a future television broadcast, and obviously it's going out on a live stream as well. We promise to get you out of here by 8:30. If you do have a question for the question and answer session, we ask that you go to one of the two microphones. There's one there, and there'll be one right over here. And we ask that you keep your questions short and questioning. After the Q&A, there will be a reception in the lobby. There will be refreshments, and you'll have an opportunity to talk to Josh directly. Everyone is invited. There will be food, and we hope you all can make it to the reception. It is my privilege to introduce Josh Rauh. Josh received his undergraduate degree from Yale and his PhD from MIT. He is presently a professor of finance at Stanford. He has developed a national reputation as an expert on one of the biggest and perhaps least talked about financial problems facing our nation, the financial crisis confronting many of our cities and states, including many cities here in California. The common denominator among these jurisdictions in crisis is their unfunded pension liabilities. Josh is going to tell us about that problem. He's going to explain how it developed and perhaps some of the things we can do to solve the problem for the long run. We are very pleased to have him here this evening. Would you please welcome Josh Rauh?
Thanks very much to Professor Bengal for that very kind introduction. It is a pleasure to be here speaking at Loyola Marymount University as part of the Paul A. Grolsch Lecture Series. My theme tonight is Cities and States in Crisis. So most citizens in the United States who follow economics or politics are aware that our federal government in Washington is facing very severe financial imbalances. The tax revenues that the federal government is taking in are substantially less than the amounts that they are spending. That's why it's reported that there is a $1 trillion deficit for this year. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit later about how you can think about the magnitude of $1 trillion. Furthermore, the promises that the federal government has made with respect to Social Security, which is the program that provides money for the elderly, and Medicare, which is the program that provides health care for the elderly, exceed the projected revenues that will be used to fund those programs by a very wide margin. So most of you are familiar with those stories, at least in passing. Now, we also regularly hear stories from across the Atlantic Ocean, from Europe, about the debt crises being experienced in Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain, and possibly Italy. These countries also are taking in far less in tax revenues than they are spending. Okay, so they also have large deficits. Furthermore, they also have programs that support their elderly and poor citizens, and those programs are also programs in which there is a large difference between the amount of resources that are being taken in and the resources that are being promised to citizens. What many people outside of economic policy circles do not realize, however, is that state and local governments right here in the United States are also facing very severe financial imbalances. The state of California, to be a primary instance, the state of Illinois, where I just moved from one distressed state to another, the city of Chicago, the city of Los Angeles, many cities in California, and really around the entire country. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is how we got to the situation where this is such a pervasive problem, and why I am so worried about these imbalances at the state and local level. Why, in a sense, I am even more worried about California and Illinois and Chicago and LA and San Diego than I am about the federal government, at least in the near term. So, as I pointed out, many outside economic policy circles don't realize how severe, how bad the situation is with state and local governments. And I say outside economic policy circles because most academic economists actually seem to agree on this point. So the University of Chicago runs an experts forum where they survey economics professors who are policy experts on a variety of economic policy matters. This is an expert panel that is diverse with respect to university geography and political tendencies. And as of the end of last month, September 2012, this group was asked whether they agreed with the following statement, which I'll put up here. The statement is as follows: during the next 2 decades, some, and I have left a blank, okay, some blank, unless they substantially increase taxes, cut spending, and or change public sector pensions, will require a combination of severe austerity budgets, a bailout, and or default. Now, if there hadn't been a giveaway in the title of this talk, Cities and States in Crisis, you might have thought that the economic policy experts were talking about Europe. You might have said during the next 2 decades, some European countries, unless they substantially increase taxes, cut spending, and or change public sector pensions, will require a combination of severe austerity budgets, a bailout, and or default. It sounds like they're talking about Europe, doesn't it? But the question that they were posed was U.S. states, and that was what was put in the blank. And 92% of economists in this forum, which if you look up the IGM Experts Forum at the University of Chicago, I think you will agree is a very diverse group with respect to their political leanings and economic geography, agreed with this statement and felt that state and local governments were in bad shape. 92% agreed, 5% were uncertain, and 3% had no opinion. So no one disagreed with this statement, okay? Which is amazing, because I think that in the general public there is more kind of uncertainty about this. I don't think you would have thought that 92% of economic policy experts would have agreed and 0 would have disagreed. So one question I want to talk about is, how could this be? All right, so if you look around on Google and you Google state balanced budgets, you will find that unlike our federal government, almost all of the states in the United States, with one exception, have a requirement that they run a balanced budget, meaning they have rules that say we cannot spend more than the taxes we take in any given year, or maybe they're allowed sort of 1 year of leeway either way. Maybe you could spend a little more than you took in 1 year and borrow a little bit and tax it, raise the taxes the following year. But most states in the U.S., with the one exception being Vermont, have some kind of requirement that they run balanced budgets. And in fact, what's interesting is that Vermont is actually a very fiscally responsible state, so perhaps they don't need that requirement. And so in fact, every state except Vermont has to balance its budget every year according to some definition, with the earliest of these provisions going back to the 19th century. So let me tell you a little bit about how this got started. In the early years of the nation's history, the federal government absorbed the debts that the states ran up during the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. In the 1830s, there was a financial panic, and at that point, the federal government said, we're not going to step in and absorb any more state debts. So even though they had taken over the debts of the states for these wars that had been fought, after 1837, they said, we're not going to do it anymore. And 8 states, including Pennsylvania and Maryland, defaulted on their debts. So they had borrowed a bunch of money from people to, either to fight wars or to run their states, and these states defaulted. They said we're not going to pay. So kind of like Greece, they sort of just defaulted. They said we're not going to pay our debts. And so at that point, the federal government had really made a statement to them. They said we're not going to support you. If you borrow money, you rack up debts. We bailed you out after the Revolutionary War and after War 1812, but this is it. We're not bailing you out anymore. And during the following 20 years, okay, the mid-19th century, 19 states subsequently implemented these balanced budget requirements. And presumably, the states realized that now that the federal backing was gone, their ability to borrow even small amounts of money for an emergency or to invest in capital projects like building a bridge or bridge the gap between when suppliers need to be paid and when tax revenues come in would be really limited, unless they promised the public that they would adhere to some standards of fiscal balance and not run a budget deficit. This also created a political culture for states to achieve balanced budgets. Which brings me back to the mystery. How can it be that according to academic economists, 92% of them believe that U.S. states are going to require austerity budgets? An austerity budget, by the way, is where you slash the heck out of spending, okay? Where you're spending money on health care for the poor, for example, on education for public universities, for public schools, and you have to cut them very dramatically in ways that hurt people. A bailout, they're talking about federal bailouts. I thought in the 19th century we said no more bailouts, and or defaulting on the money that they've borrowed from people. It sounds like Greece. How can it be that we had these balanced budget requirements and now we're at the point where people are saying that states are in these dire financial situations? How can it be that it sounds like they're basically running up against a sovereign debt crisis, not unlike what is being seen in Europe? And the answer to how this could have happened has to lie, just like it does for the federal government, in promises for future spending that have been and still are not recognized in today's budgetary process. So I'm going to show you a little bit about how that might work. Okay, so here's a diagram. I want you to imagine a fictitious state, okay? Illinois, okay? A combination between Illinois and California, all right? And the question is, for this state, I want to kind of illustrate to you what a balanced budget would look like in that state. Okay, so residents in this state are filling out tax returns, all right? So if you've worked in the state of California, you paid California state tax. And they're sending tax money, okay, to the Fed, so sort of the central government of the state, all right? And the government is then taking that money and is spending it, okay? So these bags are of equal size. The money they took from you in taxes, they're now spending on something else. And what are they doing with that money? They're building bridges. They're spending it on schools, okay? They're also spending it on policemen, on firemen, on teachers, on people digging in the road. When I was 2 years old, all I wanted to do for a living was dig in the road. And now here I am talking to you about how the pensions of people that dig in the road are now going to bankrupt us. So interesting. Now, a balanced budget would be if this state, okay, was taking in the same, if those two bags of money were of equivalent size in a given year. Think about this as 1 year's cycle, okay? So that would be a balanced budget. Now, suppose that the state wanted to spend more money than it took in taxes in a given year, okay? So the bag of money got bigger. Well, that would be not a balanced budget. And if they wanted to do that, they would have to borrow the money from someone else. So that would be not a balanced budget if they wanted to spend more on the bridges or the schools or on the policemen or firemen or teachers or people digging in the road. And the way they would do that is by borrowing money, usually in the bond market. That's how they would do it. They would issue bonds. You basically sell pieces of paper to the public. And a balanced budget requirement effectively would shut that off, right? So those balanced budget things that were put in the 19th century kind of said the two bags have to be the same, unless maybe if you're building a bridge, you are allowed to issue bonds to do long-term capital projects that will have benefits for people for many, many years to come. And there is a fair amount of kind of gaming over what really counts as a long-term capital project versus a short-run project. But these balanced budget requirements effectively shut off the possibility that this bag of money here is going to be much bigger than the bag that they're taking in. Okay, so it seems like if the two bags are the same size, then we must basically have a balanced budget. Now, unfortunately, okay, things are not quite as simple as they seem. So let's talk more about the public sector workers here. What do their contracts say when they sign up for a job? Okay, well, their contracts actually look quite different from the contracts that many of you will have seen if you've had a summer job or you worked for a couple of years. Let's get the. Oops. So, public employees, what do their contracts say? Their contracts say that in addition to some money from this bag, that's the same bag that contains the money that we collected from taxpayers, which you will get today, we also promise to pay you a pension when you retire. All right? So in addition to the money from that bag, you will get a pension when you retire. And you might be retiring in 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years in the future. We're promising that we will pay you a pension. What is a pension? Well, pension is a monthly or an annual payment that that these workers receive from the state when they retire. And the word pension generally refers to what's called a defined benefit pension. How many of you have worked either a summer job or worked for a couple years before school or something like that, students? Okay, so a fair number of people. How many of you had a defined benefit pension? Okay, like maybe somebody back there, but not very many people. Okay, maybe someone. So if you worked for the state of California, you might have been offered a defined benefit pension. I doubt you were there for long enough for it to vest as a defined benefit pension. You probably, if you had a retirement benefit, you probably had like a 401k. You probably have a 401k kind of arrangement, which I'll talk about in a minute. These public employees do not have 401ks. They have traditional pensions. These are old school pensions, okay? So these are where the employer says, I will take care of you in your retirement by paying you money. And so they're called defined benefit pensions. And typically they work with a formula that might look like this, all right? So there's some number, a percentage, which is called the benefit factor, like 3%. And there's a certain number that, after you work a certain number of years, you get to put that in your benefit formula. And then it also multiplies your final salary. So let me give you an example. These defined benefit pensions say if you work for, say, 30 years, okay, and at the end of your working life, you're making $80,000 per year, then we, the state, will give you $72,000 per year to start in your retirement. So imagine that you retire at age 55 with this package. You say you started working at age 25 and you retired at age 55. You don't have any 401k, but you do have the state giving you a check that begins at $72,000 per year. Okay, so if you work for that amount of time under this kind of plan, you have almost replaced your entire income during the time that you are working. And you get that amount as long as you live. Okay, so it's from the time you retire until the time that you die. That's what a pension benefit is. And I say to start because very often a feature of these is that they have what are called cost of living adjustments, which means that $72,000, that will be what you get when you're say you retire at age 55. That's what you'll get when you're 56. But when you're 57, you'll actually get a little more than $72,000 because these pensions are meant to keep up with inflation. So we know what inflation is when the cost of goods and services gets more and more expensive every year. These are actually indexed pension benefits. And if you look at this and you think about it, that's a pretty nice benefit, right? That you get some money from the state that is indexed to inflation, and you will be paid this amount of money every year. You are taken care of. If you worked in a summer job or you worked for a few years before school and you have a 401k, you're on your own, right? You got to try to invest that money somehow, save that money. When you retire, you got to figure out a way to spread it out and make it last over your lifetime. Here you have a state government giving you a pension. All right, so that's what a pension is. Here are some average pensions to get some numbers for some California public retirees. So up here you see some different systems, defined benefit pension systems. It would be simple and nice if every worker in the state of California all had the same deal, but they don't. It's very complicated. Some of them have a 2% in this benefit factor. Some of them have 2.5. Some of them have 3. For some of them, the benefit factor is a function of the number of years they work. It gets complicated. But what we do know is how much workers are receiving as pensions. Okay, so if you worked in CalPERS, which is the biggest public sector pension system in the country, and you worked for 15 or 20 years, you got a pension of $24,708. You can see that goes up with the amount of years that you work. If you work for 30 to 35 years, you got a pension of $66,000. You can see in some of these other rows, okay, these take care of different groups of employees. So CalPERS includes all manner of employees, a lot of state police, state firemen, state highway patrol, CHIPs, okay, are in there. You've got non-teacher school employees. You've got miscellaneous employees of all stripes, including the people that dig in the road if they're not contract workers. But now, I'm kind of obsessed with the people who dig in the road. And sometimes even when I'm, in Palo Alto, they're doing a lot of construction, so I like to ride up on my bike and ask the construction workers about their pensions. They don't typically like that so much. Anyway, Cal STRS, this is the California State Teachers Retirement System here. This is the pension system for teachers. And you can see here that these pensions are of similar magnitude, right? Maybe a little bit larger. Now here we have Los Angeles City employees. Okay, you can see how much pension, what kind of pensions they make. Los Angeles County employees, Los Angeles County safety employees. So the safety employees in LA County can get pretty big pensions. Remember, this is the annual amount that they receive, right? Every year you get that in your retirement. Here, City and Fire, LA City Fire and Police pensions. For that, the only numbers in the report that I could find were averaged over the number of years worked. Also, LA Water and Power. So there are a lot of groups of public employees that are receiving these pensions. It's interesting. These pensions were first invented by Otto von Bismarck, who introduced the first documented state pension system in the modern world in Germany in the 1880s. And initially, you had to be 70 years old to collect the pension. Now, you think about this, Germany in the 1880s, I mean, how long could you really expect to live beyond 70 years? Not very long, okay? Well, times have really changed because now we have these pensions and people are claiming them, they're entitled to claim them. They are promised that they are allowed to claim them at the age of 55 when, in many cases, the life expectancy could be a lot longer. These people could live for many, many years. You may have seen, if you read The Economist, highly recommended publication, there was an article last week about the Russian defined benefit pension system. And I was initially a bit surprised to read in this publication that Russian citizens pay only 2% into their social security system. Here we pay 12.4% per employee of pay into social security. But the reason must be that people just don't live that long. That combined with the fact that, that this was also too little money going into their system. It was in fact in crisis. The headline of the article was "Drink as you go pensions," which is a pun on pay as you go pensions, which are how people describe Social Security. But I am digressing. So now, when is retirement for these people? I alluded to age 55, but the California Public Employee Retirement System. I mean, I want to emphasize these systems together cover over 1 million workers, 1.5 million workers, just these systems up here. You got workers and retirees. There are a lot of people in these systems. When are they retiring? Public safety workers often have retirement ages at 50 or 55 with these 3% multipliers. Other workers may have 2% with retirement at 60 or 65. The Los Angeles City Council voted a couple weeks ago to raise the retirement age for newly hired civilian workers who are not part of the Water and Power from 55 to 65. So that's a pretty big difference. If you were hired yesterday by, or say you were hired a month ago by the city of Los Angeles, you thought you'd be able to claim one of these pensions at age 55. If you were hired today, you got to wait until you're age 65. So those are pretty big differences. The average age at retirement for the Los Angeles Police and Fire is 51.5 years old. Okay, so they retire when they're fairly, and people now, life expectancies are in the 80s, right? So people are living for a long time after this, and we're paying, we have to pay for it. So let me just contrast that with the arrangements you might know, like a 401k plan. If you had a summer job and you had a 401k plan, you were getting some contributions from your employer into an account, and you had to decide how you were going to invest those. You may have been given a choice of mutual funds to invest the money in. Now, I'm going to be quite critical in this talk of defined benefit pensions, as you will see, of these traditional old school pensions. But I would also point out that these 401k plans, such as the ones you might have had, do often involve people paying very high fees to mutual fund companies. If you look at just how much you're paying just to store your money with whatever company it landed with, you were paying pretty high fees probably. And you might also have found that you were a little bit at a loss as to how to invest this money. You had to decide on your own. And you guys are smart students at LMU, right? I mean, not everybody is gonna be able to figure this stuff out, and people do make bad decisions in 401ks. So I'm going to be very critical of defined benefit pensions, but as I'll talk about at the end, I don't think 401ks are for all are necessarily the answer. So let's go back to the budget. Okay, here is we have our balanced budget here. All right, the bags of money are the same size. But wait a second here, okay? So we're taking in money and we're paying it to the public sector workers. They're getting salaries. We're paying for the bridges. But hang on, because the policeman is thinking, okay, I'm going to get $88,614 per year when I retire. And the fireman is thinking, I'm going to get $63,660 per year when I retire. The teacher is thinking, I'm going to get $58,444 per year when I retire. And the person digging in the road, I guess my dream should have been the policeman, not the guy digging in the road, was going to be $54,924 per year when I retire. I just kind of picked these numbers, arbitrarily based on some kind of, arbitrary working ages. But these are pretty close to the kinds of retirement packages that California public sector workers expect. So now, is the budget balanced or not? Because before we had these pensions, it seemed like it was balanced. But now these people are expecting these pensions to be paid. So we have to think about, all right, if we just made these promises without planning for these people, then we would really be doing something that would be pretty unfair to the people who are going to be paying taxes when these folks are retired. And you know who's going to be paying taxes when these folks are retired? You guys. Okay, you guys are going to be paying taxes when these folks are retired. So if we're not planning well for this, then you guys are going to face the following problem. You're going to be paying taxes, and you're going to want to hire policemen and firemen and teachers. You're going to want public services, and you're going to want to raise tax money for that. But these folks here who worked for me, worked for us, worked for people who are of an older generation, when we were younger, they're saying, wait, so you also have to pay me a pension. So as young people who are going to have long working lives in front of you, you should be very concerned about whether or not we are setting aside enough money to pay for these pensions today. Because if we are not, you're going to have to pay double. You're going to have to pay both for these people who will be retired when you're looking for teachers for your kids and public safety and people to come put out fires at your house. And you'll have to pay for the people who are actually doing those services for you in real time. So you should be very concerned about this issue. All right? Are we planning properly for the fact that all of these public employees are going to have to be paid these pensions? Your alternative might be to try to renegotiate with them. Which means you could tell these people maybe when you're working, well, I'm sorry, I don't have the money to pay the policeman a pension. The policemen are not going to take kindly to that. Okay, policemen are tough people. You don't want to just go to this guy and say, he doesn't have a face here, but you don't want to just go to the guy and say, I'm sorry, I'm not paying you a pension because they can make your life difficult. Okay, so it's really a problem. So you'd be in a bind. Now, so clearly the worst possible thing would be if we were ignoring pensions altogether, right? If current generations of government really wanted to give you guys a bad deal and claim all the benefits for us, we could just tell these people they were going to get these pensions and then just not set any money aside today to plan for it, right? Then you guys would be really in trouble. We'd just say, oh yeah, don't worry, the future taxpayers will pay your pensions. I met this great group of LMU students and they said they were happy to do it. Okay, now fortunately, we don't actually do that. There is some planning, okay? There is some planning for the fact that these people are going to have to be paid pensions. And what principles guide that? Well, intergenerational fairness, which says that each generation should pay for the services that it consumes. So my generation, I have 2 young kids, they go to public school, we should be paying for the services that we are consuming. And in fact, the teacher would presumably need to be paid more if we were not offering her a pension, right? If we weren't telling her that she was going to expect this pension when she retired, we'd have to pay more. So you have to be really worried. Are the current generations of people consuming services from firemen, policemen, teachers without really paying for them? And to answer that question, we have to think a little bit about how much money would have to be set aside from today's tax bag for pensions. All right, so here's today's tax bag. And what we have to be doing in order to be running a balanced budget, in order to be achieving intergenerational fairness, is splitting that bag into 2 bags. The first bag goes to pay the wages of these people today, all right, and also to build the bridges, okay? The second bag has to be going to contribute money to a pension fund that is then going to sit in the fund, and it's going to be the money that is going to be sufficient to pay the pensions for these people 20 or 30 years later. So the planning of that is really important. How we are planning for that today is very important. So how do we plan for that today? How much do governments set aside today for a given promise? And what is a balanced budget when a state is making these promises? Well, typically it works the following way. Here's that pension fund. We're setting aside some money today. And there's a board called the Government Accounting Standards Board that tells states to budget in the following way. They tell them, you should assume a return that you're going to earn on the assets in that little contribution bag and budget accordingly. Okay, so GASB stands for the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. And they tell the governments to budget with an assumed return on assets. And state and local governments dutifully assume that every dollar they contribute to pension funds will grow at this assumed rate of return. Now, you should be really interested in what they are assuming, okay? Because suppose they were assuming a number that was too high. If they're assuming a number that's too high, like suppose that they were assuming that their assets were going to, double every year. Okay, it's hard to make your assets double every year by investing in the stock market. Okay, but suppose they were assuming that, then you would be really worried because you would say, wait a second here. These people today who are sending their kids to public school and are reaping the benefits of public services, they're not really paying these people the total amount that they're promising. They're promising money in the future that you guys are going to have to pay. So this assumed return on assets is really important. The assumed return on assets is what they use as what's called a discount rate. I was on National Public Radio. I had an hour-long interview with National Public Radio, and it was an hour long in the studio. The whole interview was not used in the final piece, but I talked for an hour, and then at the end, I actually thought the microphone was off, and I said, you know that William Carlos Williams poem, "So Much Depends on a Red Wheelbarrow"? Well, in my world, it's "so much depends on that darn discount rate," meaning that assumed return on assets. That's the one soundbite that made it onto the program. But the point is that this does depend on, this assumed rate of return is really important. And how did they come up with this assumed rate of return? Fortunately for you, okay, it's not that bad. They don't assume the money is going to double every year. But they do assume that the money is going to do as well as it has historically. These pension funds are invested in stocks, bonds, and alternative assets. All right, alternative assets include private equity, venture capital, hedge funds, and real estate. These are investment vehicles, private funds that can invest in risky but potentially high returning investments. Right? So private equity, you probably have heard a lot about private equity these days, since one of the presidential nominees was is a former private equity executive. So they invest in companies, try to turn them around and sell them back for a profit. Venture capitalists, where I'm from up in Palo Alto and also here, are of course very big. Because they fund new ventures. Hedge funds, they engage in trading strategies. They try to find clever, usually algorithmic, computer-driven trading strategies. Real estate, we all know what that is. So now these alternative assets are about 20% of these portfolios, and that's kind of a new thing. All right, historically, it was pretty much only stocks and bonds, and historically, that portfolio of stocks and bonds returned around 8% per year. So what do you think they're assuming? They're assuming that the assets that they're setting aside in the pension fund are going to earn 8% per year in a compound annualized way. So you remember, think about kind of math class. What compound annualized means is, if you set aside $1, after 1 year you have $1.08, and after 2 years you have 1.08 squared, and 3 years 1.08 cubed. And if you graph that out, you see the money growing really fast. All right? So let's just say that they're assuming that the money that they invest is going to grow really fast in a way that is consistent with the way that it grew historically. All right? So historically, it grew really fast as well. So is that a reason to be worried? Should we be worried? Should you be worried that they're assuming that the money is going to grow as fast as it has historically? And I would argue that the answer to that is yes. Okay? And there are a few reasons for that. I mean, one just really basic reason is that right now, the kind of returns you can earn on safe assets are really, really low. If you look at government bond yields, for example, if you buy a bond from the federal government, if you loan the federal government $1,000 for 1 year, you probably get about $1,000.02 at the end of the year. Okay, you're not going to grow money very quickly by investing in government bonds. It used to be that government bonds yielded 5% even on a one-year horizon, and that's the time period over which these historical returns were earned. Other reasons to think that we might not earn 8% per year. I mean, these things here, these are risky, right? I mean, there's no free lunch here. We're not necessarily going to earn this. I think the right way to think about it is that without your being asked for your input, we have pretty much said that we're going to fund these pension promises by investing in the stock market. And if the stock market performs as well as it did historically, which, by the way, is the last the last half of the 20th century was a bull market of unprecedented proportions. So if the stock market continues to have a bull market of unprecedented proportions, then, well, we're still actually not fully in balance with these pensions. You'll have to pay a little bit. If not, you'll have to pay a lot. So you basically have, without really being asked, you're providing insurance for us, for the public sector to be investing in the stock market. And you're doing that for free, and I think that's something you should be worried about. I'm going to give you an example about expected returns and measuring debt with expected returns. Let's just suppose, okay, that you have a debt of $100,000. Think of this. Suppose you were in this situation. All right, you have a debt of $100,000 that's due in 15 years, and you have no other debt. All right. Say you also have a carefully chosen number, $20,071 in cash. In cash, okay, and no other assets. All right. So this is your financial position. All right. And say maybe you have a job. All right. And you go to a bank and apply for a loan at the bank. Okay. Well, the bank is going to look at this and they're going to say, well, all right, you have some cash. You owe some money here, $100,000 due in 15 years. And, if you got a really good job, they might say, you're worth the risk, we'll lend you the money. If you don't have a good job, they might say, oh, this doesn't look so good. Okay. Now, the bank will assess your financial position. Okay, so here's a question for you. Suppose you got rejected by the bank, and you were really upset. You said, they don't understand, I'm going to get a great job later, but I have an idea. That $20,071 that was in cash, I am now going to move that into the stock market. I'm going to return to the bank and say, you guys got it wrong. You didn't understand that I'm going to invest this money in assets that historically have earned a lot of money. Here are the numbers, actually. Okay, common stocks since 1900 have earned 11.3% annualized. It was a historic, unprecedented bull market. Okay, so how about the following logic? You go to the bank and you say, look, you guys, what you don't realize is that my $20,070, if I grow that at a 11.3% annualized return, which means that after 1 year, I'm going to have, 111.3% of that, and then 1.113 squared, and then cubed, it's going to grow exponentially. What you guys at the bank don't realize is that in 15 years, I'm going to have paid off my $100,000 debt. Bingo, okay? Because historically, the stocks performed this well. They returned 11% per year. So I'm going to assume that they're going to return 11% per year going forward. How about that logic? What do you think the bank would do if you said that? The bank would laugh at you, right? The bank, or they might haul you off to jail if you actually signed a form with it. But just to go back, I mean, the point is you had $100,000 due in 15 years. That was your debt. You had $20,071 in cash. Moving that $20,000 to stocks, it doesn't matter that stocks perform well historically. $20,000 of cash is worth the same as $20,000 of stocks. It doesn't matter. It won't help. The bank would laugh at you. But the fact is that this is exactly what the public sector is doing. What they're doing is they say, well, if we had this money in cash, then we'd really be in trouble here. We'd owe a lot more money than we've got in cash. But because we have it in stocks, and stocks have done so well historically, we are going to pretend that we have no debt. All right, and that's what the public sector accounting is equivalent to. If you move to stocks, could you say you are debt-free today because this money is going to grow? Obviously not. Okay, but this governmental accounting says yes. So I mean, it's crazy. I mean, there are so many things that are wrong with that example that it's hard to know where to start. But I just want to talk through a few. I mean, first of all, most would argue that assuming that the stock market is going to generate 11.3% annualized, compound annualized going forward, just because it did in the 20th century, is just not realistic, okay? Because over this time period, a lot of things were really different. Interest rates were much higher. Interest rates on safe stuff were much higher. There was a lot of inflation over this time period, okay? So it's just not realistic. Nor, for that matter, is what they do with government bonds. They actually continue effectively to assume that government bonds are going to return what they did historically as well, which is about 5%. Right now, government bonds yield, close to zero. In order for them to return 5%, you'd have to the price of those bonds would have to go way up. So that's also not realistic. And part of what the impact of that has been, if you remember back here, I showed you that they're invested a lot in. They've started putting money in these alternative asset classes. Why have they started doing that? It's because they realize that they're never going to achieve 8% if they don't take a whole bunch of additional risk and invest in riskier stuff. So now you guys are writing. You should think about this. You have written insurance on these portfolios. It's actually trillions of dollars. I'm going to talk about how much it is, but pretty much each of you has promised to pay if we don't have a repeat of the historical bull market, and the amount you've promised to pay is about $40,000 each. Okay, so thanks very much, but you should be really upset about that. All right, and you might think, oh well, this is a little complicated, right? It seems like this stuff is hidden there, and that's exactly why we have this problem here. Is that the governments are supposed to be running balanced budgets, so they had to find a way of kind of hiding the debt from you, and that's what they've done. They've hidden it by assuming that they're going to get these returns. So it's these assumptions here are unrealistic. The assumptions that you're going to keep earning, that they're going to keep earning 11.3% on stocks is unrealistic. It doesn't quite get to the point of why the bank actually won't give you any credit at all for moving your $20,000 into stocks, right? The bank will laugh at you for this. They won't give you any credit at all. It's interesting. I mean, you might, if you think about it, I mean, if you asked me, will stocks outperform bonds going forward, I would say, more likely than not, but there is substantial risk here. And as the old adage goes, past performance is no guarantee of future performance. So we've told the public employees that they're going to get these pensions no matter what the stock market does, and proper financial accounting would reflect that guarantee. So this is not, there is no free lunch in investing in stocks and hoping that they will earn these returns. There's also a chance that very bad outcomes will happen. And the sort of science of finance thinks about, well, what are the states of the world in which these very good or very bad outcomes happen? If the stock market doesn't really keep cranking out very high returns, that's also probably going to reflect kind of a poor business environment. And it's probably also going to be correlated with the fact that your job prospects are going to be weaker as well. So not only have you sold insurance on all of these assets here, trillions of dollars worth of assets without your knowing, but you've also promised to pay and make good in what would potentially be the most painful times for you, the times when you might not have a job. So you're sort of set up to be hit with a double whammy. If the economy underperforms the lofty expectations, you're already going to be hurting, and you'll have to having to pay the difference between these public sector pensions is going to hurt even more. I don't think we should be making public policy on the basis of some returns that are less than 50-50 likely to be true. I think that's actually irresponsible. Okay, so measuring the pension promises. Well, if it's not right to assume an 8% expected return on the assets, then what is the right thing to do? Well, first of all, so I've done some calculations of that and kind of recalculating numbers. I usually consider just already promised benefits. So I imagine that our political system could potentially change these systems if they really wanted to. That's pretty conservative because in California, the legal assumption seems to be that public workers are entitled to continue to earn benefits under a formula that's at least as generous as the formula that was in place on the day that they began work. So we have to use much lower discount rates to measure these things. And the real question is, are we paying these pensions or not? If we're paying them, we've got to measure them using essentially what are default free yield curves. And this is the way that promises are measured in the private sector. Another thing I want to point out is if you look at Vallejo, California, right, it's a city, just up the state. The city went bankrupt. The people who had loaned money to the state were the bondholders. They had to restructure their claims. The people who were promised pensions, they kept their pensions. All right. The same thing happened with Orange County, the bankruptcy in the 1990s of Orange County. Orange County had to restructure its bond payments, but the people who were promised pensions kept their pensions. New York City in the 1970s had a financial crisis. They couldn't get people to loan them money to keep operating, and the people who were owed pensions, those pensions were made whole. And we're telling public sector workers you're going to get these pensions, so we should probably measure them as such, as guarantees. A good approach might be to measure these benefits as payments that we're not going to default upon. In my research, I did some work where I looked at what the benefits were that we've promised already to state and local workers around the United States. And this shows you here a graph. I'll tell you what the lines are in a second. This is the amount of money that we're paying right now. So this is about $150 billion are being paid in pensions to state workers. And these are just the current workers, the people who are currently employed. It doesn't include the new workers that are being hired. But you can see there are a few lines here, and they kind of bound the most versus the least that we'll have to pay for workers who are currently part of the state system. And you'll see that there are these different lines here. This top line is actually, if we just keep running the systems forward without changing them at all, okay, we'll be up to about $500 billion per year. If we froze the benefits and said, we're not going to take any benefits away from anybody, but we are going to move to a 401k kind of plan for work going forward, we would then be at the blue line, which is about peaks out at about $260 billion. What does this actually translate into? Well, we measure these things using some numbers, okay? So I'm going to give you numbers in trillions, and then I'm going to explain what trillions actually mean. So if you just add up the reports of public sector pension systems around the U.S., you find that there's about $1.3 trillion in unfunded liabilities. All right, so how much is $1 trillion? Well, there are about 117 million households in the United States. So a useful way to think about $1 trillion is that it's about $9,000 per household. Okay, so if somebody says, well, there's $1 trillion worth of debt here, you can think of that as meaning that every household in the United States would have to be taxed $9,000 lump sum today to fix that. Another way to think about it is, which I find less useful, is how far would a stack of $1 trillion $1 bills reach? And it turns out it would, most agree it would go to the moon and back 4 times. But there's some debates in physics about whether that's really true. A lot of the physicists point out that the stack would probably tip over, so which is a valid concern. So that's why I prefer to think about trillions of dollars in terms of per household numbers. So this 1.3 trillion here, this works out to be about $11,403 per U.S. household. Okay, and whoops, I didn't want to do that quite yet. We also have CalPERS and CalSTRS. So these are your California state ones. All right, so these are 176 billion. These are just the official figures, by the way. And a lot of what I've been telling you about is how the official figures do not reflect the reality of the fact that we're not going to earn 8% compound annualized returns in these things. Okay, this is even assuming that they do earn 8% compound annualized returns in these things. Okay, so so what does this amount to? Well, if you're a citizen of California, every 100 billion amounts to about $8,000 per household. Okay, so this says we're at about $14,000 per household for California, just the California public sector plans, and then you've got LA, city, county, water, fire, and police. I added those up. I found 25 billion. So every 10 billion for LA County is about $3,100 per household. So basically, you're on the hook for tens of thousands of dollars here, even if the assets that they set aside in the pension funds earn 8% returns, which they are very unlikely to earn. So a lot of what I've done in research has been to try to correct that. All right, so I correct it and find that in fact the unfunded liabilities, the debt that you owe, is in fact a lot greater. All right, so I use bond rates. Bond rates is what the private sector uses. They recognize that these promises to public sector workers are like bonds, all right? So we should use bond rates. If we're telling public sector workers, you guys are going to get these pensions no matter what the stock market does. That means that the way we measure these things can't have anything to do with our assumptions of how the stock market is going to do. So what we found in 2009, our study, that there was 3.1 trillion of unfunded liabilities, okay? So that's 12 round trips to the moon. But perhaps more more useful for you, right? Every trillion is about $9,000. So we're looking at about, at that time, about $30,000 per household. And then CalPERS ends up being around 342 billion. Every 100 billion is about $8,000 per household for California. And then LA ends up being 55 billion. Finally, okay, what about today? Well, things have actually gotten a lot worse, because it turns out that these promises, if you want to try to deliver on these promises today at a time when bonds are yielding basically nothing, we're really up to 4.4 trillion, which is around $40,000 per U.S. household. So there is a lot of hidden unfunded debt, and it's almost the case where you might have thought, because states had these balanced budget requirements, that you didn't have to worry about this. But in fact, because they were assuming these returns all along that are very unrealistic and that are not going to be met, there is a lot of debt there that you're going to be asked to pay. Now, you may have heard about there have been some outrages and abuses surrounding public sector pensions as well. So there was this actually makes the news a lot, because in the U.S. we like to have sort of sensational stories. Okay, so unfortunately, these sensational stories are more common than not these days. But in Contra Costa County, the fire chief a couple years ago retired at age 51. He had been making a $186,000 salary and somehow managed to get a $240,000 per year annual pension at the age of 51. At this point, you may be wondering how you can sign up for a job as a fireman. Okay, but how did he manage to do that? Well, he was able to have the city repurchase his sick pay credits from him, and that amount kind of counted in the salary that set his pension for life. That's called spiking, like spiking a football. So these get a lot of attention, pension spiking, these kinds of things, because it makes people mad. It makes taxpayers mad. They say, it seems unfair. There were some in the city of Bell, California. There were some public sector workers who were earning $700,000 or $800,000 per year, and they were setting their pensions accordingly. Right, so that made taxpayers really mad. They said, we're going to do something. And I think these stories about pension spiking, they have a feature that they do get people kind of excited about the issue. But the kind of taxpayer organizations have calculated that spiking might cost California about $100 million per year. Okay, so $100 million is like a 0.1 on one of these things. So it's like a 0.1. So, yeah, and it's if it's per year, okay, if you think about it over many years, all right, then maybe we might add some 1 billion numbers to some of these things, to these CalPERS numbers maybe, might add it or increase it by 1 billion or so. But really the problem is not the spiking. The spiking is, it's really distasteful, it makes taxpayers angry, but it's not really the problem. And California recently passed a pension reform that took aim at this by capping pension payouts at $132,000 per year, and they assumed that sort of was going to generate some billions of dollars of savings for them. But the fact is, the real problem is, again, just these return assumptions. And the other thing I want to be clear about is that the governments that have used this pension accounting effectively to circumvent balanced budget rules are far more to blame than the public employees. The fact that these debts are owed to public employees almost makes people who criticize the system seem like villains. I mean, those who make the financial point that public employee guarantees are expensive are actually generally vilified, or in some cases even scapegoated, for making this point, because people fear that might hurt public employees going forward. So you have to try to separate out the fact that the people to whom we borrow from whom we've borrowed this money are public sector workers, and we owe them the money. You have to separate that out, and you have to recognize that it's not them who are the problem. It's the promises that have been made. And while there is spiking, the spiking is fairly rare, relatively rare events in terms of having a real financial impact. The fact that this is such a disguised problem has also made it hard to bring the issue to the forefront. It's a hidden problem, and it's a little bit kind of statisticsy. I mean, it's like, okay, what kind of return are you going to assume on these assets? And there are many false arguments that apologists for the current system will bring up. So one of my favorite arguments to debunk is that contributions to defined benefit pension systems are only currently around 4% of government revenues. So how can pensions be responsible for this crisis that we're having now? Well, that's like looking at a bunch of households who bought really expensive houses and aren't paying mortgages and are just basically letting their mortgage debt pile up and say, well, they're only really paying about 4% of their household income on this mortgage or a credit card debt, right? If I looked at a household that just borrowed on their credit card and didn't even think about paying it, they would look like they were paying a pretty small amount of money towards paying off that credit card. You don't want to conclude from that these pensions are not a problem. The real question is, how fast the debt is rising and how much they should be paying to keep it from rising, which turns out to be about 2.5 times what they're paying now. Some cities in California, like San Jose, San Diego, now the LA has done something, have tried to make some changes that try to address this problem. But it's been an uphill battle, and part of that is that governments, again, goes back to the balanced budgets we were talking about to begin with. This is the way that governments have been able to spend money today without taxing. They essentially tell public sector workers, we're paying you these pensions when you retire. You should be willing to accept lower pay. The workers accept lower pay, and then they retire, and we owe them all this money. And that's one of the reasons that we've been unable to get the reforms is politicians look at this and they say, geez, I know the finance people are basically right about these measurements, about these expected returns. But if we lower these rates, we're going to have to start contributing more money today, which is going to mean more taxes today and less spending today. And I can't do that because I might not get reelected. So there is really this is such an entrenched problem that it's very, very hard. It takes real political courage to get any kind of movement on this. And a lot of the reforms that get touted, the ones that have been made, like the recent California reform that asks public employees to pay half the cost of their pensions, I mean, you have to be really careful in thinking about whether this really resolves the problem or not. Politicians will come forth and say, we've fixed the problem. But in fact, that only applies to new hires. We still have 35 years of people who have been hired that we have to work through before we get there. And furthermore, that refers to the mismeasured cost. I mean, it's really about half the true cost. So the plan is really only asking public employees to pay about 1/4 the cost of their pensions, and most of the costs are still hidden and are building. Now, let me talk about some places that have actually made reforms, and in the final minutes, what I think we should do. So the most far-reaching reforms have been in Rhode Island, all right, small state, but they were facing a situation where 20% of their revenues were going to pension funding, all right? That's really a problem, just pensions for public sector employees, who might make up, 1 in 8 of the individuals in the state, or 1 in 10. So they recently implemented changes that affected the state's entire workforce. They didn't fix the accounting problem, the measurement problem, which I think means that they're going to continue the debts are going to continue to grow. But they did implement some of the pensions were changed so that they have kind of a bit of a 401k kind of element. Now, I think the best change would be to fix the pension accounting so the pension promises are measured at the actual cost, and then we can decide what we want to do. And what that's probably going to mean is that prospectively looking forward, some of the benefits are going to have to be less generous, but taxes are also going to have to rise. Spending's going to also have to be cut. We're going to have to meet in the middle on this. Other things that have gained traction are changes in cost of living adjustments, for example, which are those additions. Remember at the beginning I told you about $72,000 per year, growing at 3% per year. Well, maybe we could change the rate at which they grow. Even better would be what they do in the Netherlands. So there's a wonderful pensions research institute in the Netherlands called NetSpar. And when I'm making fun of myself, I usually say that of all of the pensions research institutes in the Netherlands that focus on defined benefit pensions, this is the most prestigious. And I'm a fellow of this pensions research institute. Okay, it's not really, anyway, failed joke, but okay, it's a wonderful research institute, and I'm proud to be affiliated with it. But when I go and so how do they measure pension? In the Netherlands, they measure pensions not using an 8% discount rate, but basically using 0 at the short end of the curve. And then for very long run stuff, they allow them to use a number of maybe up to 4%. When I come from the States and I fly over there and talk about 8%, I think they think I visited one of the coffee shops or something. I mean, they think that this is crazy what we're doing. But they have systems where they're called pooled defined contribution systems. And in a pooled defined contribution arrangement, individuals basically own shares in the pension fund. It would be like public sector workers owning shares in CalPERS without being guaranteed something that requires a 8% return. They own shares in CalPERS, and that way we have a mix of the systems. It's called a true hybrid system, where their benefit is not purely guaranteed by the public, but the investments are pooled. And that's kind of what I would like to see happen. It's not unlike TIAA-CREF, which is an organization that provides retirement savings products for some college and university professors. I'm not part of that. I'm not offered that. I think these kind of pooled systems would be better. These hybrid systems, it'd be better than trying to choose between two bad extremes. These 401ks where the fees are high, where the investment choices are poor, where people often make mistakes, where they don't save enough, versus these defined benefit systems where essentially the government is using them to hide debts and deficits that you guys will have to pay back unless we change something now and change the way that the pensions are being offered. Just to conclude, is this a big or a small problem? Compared to the federal debt of $16 trillion, maybe these numbers seem small, and then much more in Medicare and Social Security liabilities. Okay, so maybe $4.4 trillion seems small. But what's the one thing the federal government has got that, say Greece didn't have? The federal government controls the money supply. They can print dollars if they need to print dollars. State and local governments cannot. You look at Europe, you might wonder, how could Greece, a country that is 2% of GDP, cause these enormous ripples throughout the economy and bring the European economy to its knees? Well, the reason why is because it's a systemic problem, and it highlighted this overextension and the realization that others are not far behind. And I think the crisis happens when confidence is lost, when the assets start running down in the pension funds, or when required contributions under state rules start taking over budgets. I predict this will happen to a number of states in the not too distant future, and is happening to municipalities already. So thank you for listening through my talk, and I'm happy to take questions.